You're listening to Big Table, a podcast about books and conversation presented by Hat and Beard Press, Dub Lab, and Gold Diggers in Los Angeles. I'm your host, JC Gabel. For each episode, we speak to one author about a singular book in a long-form interview. Each interview is then followed by a brief reading, sometimes from the same book being discussed, sometimes by a like-minded title and a different author. But every episode does retain a loose theme throughout, and is inspired by the work of radio host and oral historian Studs Terkel. Thanks for listening. Nathaniel Rich is a prolific writer. He comes from the enviable position of being able to balance the art of novel writing with an intrepid journalism career simultaneously. Few writers of his generation have been published so widely. His latest collection of essays and profiles, Second Nature, Scenes from a World Remade, published by MCD FSG, is the perfect companion to his last book, Losing Earth, A Recent History, which help unpack the notion that the US government knew about the perils of climate change in the late 70s, but that the Reagan Revolution, beginning in 1980, kicked the can down the road in cahoots with special interests, of course, for another generation or two. Even now, as Americans, we can hardly find consensus on the issue of the root causes of climate change. Half of the country believes it's a left-wing hoax instead of an existential threat to the planet. The science, of course, says it is a real threat. Second Nature reminds us that chemical companies and governmental hubris still happen right out in the open, and that the only way to combat the climate crisis is to expose the bad actors who perpetuate misinformation and to take on the industry lobbyists that wave an invisible hand over governmental regulations and environmental laws. Rich and I have known each other personally for over 15 years. We started off by talking about his move to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and how this informed him reporting on the natural world. Here's my conversation with Nathaniel Rich. I reread your, last book, Losing Earth, which began as this epic piece of reportage in the New York Times Magazine. And then you followed it up with Second Nature. And I'm wondering, was it moving to New Orleans and just witnessing firsthand all the weird environmental stuff that goes down there, what got you interested in this subject more as a writer?
It has to play a role. I mean, you can't. I moved here about 5 years after Katrina, and it was still, it still felt like we were in it in a sense. The city was in it. Mentally, the trauma was alive and tangible and part of daily life, and that really, I think, it informed the writing of Odds Against Tomorrow, and it sort of has to have informed, I think, my interests over this period. I mean, I was already, interested in environmental issues. I mean, not necessarily out of any kind of activist position, but although I support, environmental activism, of course, but more out of a feeling that it's the story of our time, that we're alive now in this moment when all of our basic preconceptions about the natural world are being violently overthrown. And we are in this moment of tremendous responsibility, trying to determine what kind of world we're going to enter. And people who live in New Orleans, I think, have been forced to confront these issues, not only since Katrina, but really since the founding of the city. It's always been this extremely precarious place to live. It's the nickname, like the impossible city, because it shouldn't be here. It's only here because of the incredible amount of human intervention in the landscape, and it's of course perpetually threatened by hurricanes and disease and a long history of cataclysmic fires and so on. And so there's an immediacy that some of these that environmental disasters have in this city. It's part of the culture here, and nobody knows when will be the last year that we can live in New Orleans. So I think, it forces you to face up to some of these ideas in a more intimate way living down here. And I think that has, I think, carried into my work.
The pieces that stuck with me the most were the stuff in the first section of the book, which you called the crime section. And there were so many what moments while I was reading this that I was like, wait, what? Like the chemical companies are allowed to self-regulate them? You're almost like, how is this ever possible? And I guess it sort of starts with your last book, which was this idea that they'd kind of figured out climate change in the 70s during the Carter administration, but then the rise of Reagan and Reaganism and his cronyistic, relationship with the fossil fuel companies and just lobbyists in general basically dusted that under the rug in the early 80s. And so now, some 40 years later, we're contending with all this. Pivoting to Second Nature, I feel like these books are almost intertwined. I don't know if you see it that way.
Yeah, they seem very much like part of the same project. I mean, you had asked before about going from Losing Earth to Second Nature. It actually was the other way around, in that the stories in Second Nature, I started writing some of them as long as, almost a decade ago now. And at first I didn't, not only did I not see it as a book, I didn't really see even connections between the stories that I was being drawn to in my journalism. And the way I would have defined it then was not that I was writing about environmental issues. It was that I was writing about things that I found spooky or, uncanny or creepy or bizarre in some way that unsettled me. And I feel like, the story of how we failed to act on climate change for a decade, before it was a political issue, before there was a concerted effort, conspiracy by the oil and gas industry to try to thwart any meaningful climate policy, that failure is a good example of what I'm talking about. But so is, the story of how DuPont for 50 years mass produced this chemical, man-made chemical that it knew to be toxic, and got away with it, and essentially has poisoned all of us. We all carry this DuPont chemical now in our blood, PFOA. It's become part of our biological inheritance. It's so ubiquitous now. Or, the stories of sea stars committing violent suicide out of nowhere up and down the Pacific coast, or the story of this mysterious gas leak in Porter Ranch in Los Angeles. That was the biggest climate disaster of the decade that nobody even seemed to be aware of, including people in the middle of Los Angeles. They're all stories that are unsettling, that I think it raises questions. They raise questions to which there aren't always clear answers, or the answers are complicated or even conflicting. And those are in stories like that is where I've found the most dramatic stories to tell as a writer. And so I've been drawn to that over and over again. And it's really only years into this kind of work that I started to see the connections between them, and to see how, a story of bringing back extinct species might relate to the story of the Aspen billionaires trying to save the world from climate change while flying all over in their private jets, or, the story of a mad artist creating a glow in the dark rabbit as a art stunt. It all started to, I started to realize this is really all a version of a larger story, which is about our changing relationship with the natural world and our changing understanding of humans' involvement in transforming the natural world to our own specifications, for good and for evil. And so once I started seeing those connections, I started to realize that this was one big project. And so I feel like the two books are sort of two halves of a larger project. I mean, Losing Earth, to sort of the simplest version is Losing Earth is essentially how did we get here? And Second Nature is where are we going? What's the future of this? And what's the future of our relationship with nature? And what kind of choices do we have to make as we forge ahead?
I want to come back to a couple pieces that you referenced offhand. just a second ago. And by the way, I think some of the titles of these pieces are really great. The Frankenstein in the Lower Ninth Ward piece, which almost kind of has this 12 Monkeys, Terry Gilliam kind of like undercurrent. I mean, a lot of this stuff kind of reads dystopian. To your point about Porter Ranch, I thought the connection that you made with Porter Ranch and this Russian guy, Igor Volotchkov, I'm not sure if I've got it right, where he was in Chernobyl and witnessed that and survived that. And then he's here now and he's basically saying what this is almost worse. And
he's saying, I left Chernobyl for another Chernobyl.
Yeah.
It's my fate. It's my fate to survive Chernobyls.
And one of the things, and you're in a very enviable position in that you are capable of both fiction and nonfiction, which a lot of writers are not. But, some of the plot points in these stories almost read like a novel, where the way they found out that the Porter Ranch gas leak was going on is people's parrots and dogs started dying. And like their pets started to drop dead. And they're like, oh, wait, maybe there's something wrong here. And meanwhile, they're not being told by the government about what's really happening. So it's unclear whether there's going to be crazy long-term effects of this. And I think if I remember correctly, it took many months to plug this little leak.
Yeah. I mean, it's a crazy story because it's essentially like a Deepwater Horizon story of an uncapped gas leak, gas instead of oil, obviously, and in the mountains above Los Angeles. And it's like a white noise comes to kind of suburban LA is sort of the feeling of that scene there, and it became like a parable, I felt, for climate change, in that there's this massive release of methane. These mountains are hollowed out inside, and they're used as storage tanks for natural gas that is piped into all through Los Angeles. And one of the wells in the mountain sprung a leak, and they couldn't cap it. It was an invisible leak. It took them something like 3 or 4 months finally to cap it. But in that time, it had released more greenhouse gas emissions than a lot of small nations in that time had done. And so it was this huge contributor to global warming, a huge climate disaster. But the only thing that people in the community were worried about was whether or not they were getting poisoned in some way by the gas. And they're still trying to determine whether people were harmed. I mean, it's a difficult thing to prove. There's already a huge amount of air pollution in Los Angeles. It seems like there was a lot. There were higher levels of pollutants right after the leak, but perhaps a little bit after that, because everybody fled the community. Air pollution levels actually dropped considerably, sort of like as they did in COVID when nobody drove their cars. And so, what happened then was that it became this sort of mass panic where people turned inward, and you learned a lot about each person in the community by how they responded to this specter of this poisonous gas. But of course, the one thing that nobody cared about was the climate effect. And you can understand why that is. Of course, you're going to be more concerned for your health than for something as abstract as a contribution to global warming. And yet, you could sort of see how that continues to be true as you go up the scale. And it's one of the reasons we're in the bind that we're in now with climate change, is that there's always more pressing immediate concerns than climate change. And yet in the long run, it's climate change that will undo us.
Yeah, and there's no going back. It's almost like the Jurassic Park analogy, which again, by the way, speaking of Spielberg, you made an amazing connection, which I didn't realize, but I had recently watched E.T. with my 2 young boys for the first time in ages, and they shot the movie in Porter Ranch. So the whole time I'm watching this, I'm like, where is this in LA? Like, I know it's somewhere in the valley. And, but it almost looks like it could be New Mexico too, or Arizona, because you're like this quasi-desert, mountainous region. And, sure enough, after reading, your new book, I was like, that's it, Porter Ranch. So the idea that that's the backdrop of where this horrible, leak took place. And I'm with you. I remember there was some media attention at the time, but it wasn't contextualized the way that your piece made it sound. Like you said, they were expelling more, carbon emissions than entire countries in this 4-month period. And, we can't have these kinds of mistakes keep happening. Like the Exxon Valdez where the guy's just drunk and runs into something. I mean, you're right to the point about it always seems like this is always put to the side as the issue that we have to deal with first, when in reality, this would kind of make the whole world work better. And, I guess the rights argument is always, well, we can't stop China and India, so why should we do anything? But that's not leadership.
Well, it's also a cumulative problem. And so, whether or not natural gas is spilling from a mountain in Los Angeles or from, a leak in Shanghai or a car in Yemen, it's all adding to the debt. And that, the collective aspect of it and the long-term aspect of it are two of the big problems that people have with trying to first understand the issue and then summoning up the energy and the political will to act on it. And I felt like in Porter Ranch, you sort of saw that in high relief, where you had this whole community terrorized by this leak, but essentially terrorizing themselves about, what kind of damage it might be doing to them, when we're not even sure that they were getting sick at all, that, whether it wasn't entirely, that people's anxiety, didn't cause the symptoms themselves. And so that's still as I said, that's still a question before the courts, essentially. And yet, nobody was really able to talk about the larger issue. And I feel like, that's the kind of thing that I've seen over and over again in these stories where you have, whatever's happening in the moment gets massive attention. But then the larger stories, these of transformational change, of the way in which, we are moving from, into a very radically new relationship with the natural world, where, not only are we acknowledging that we've altered every square inch of, land and every cubic inch of air through our activities, but we're now asking questions about, well, if we have these incredible technological powers, how can we use them for good and not just destructively? And so, I was just as interested in stories about people who are trying to think about ways to use some of our most powerful tools, genetic engineering, land creation, to try to, if not bring back what we've lost, then recreate it in some new way. And I think that's, in a way, that's just as eerie. The stories about efforts to sort of play God are just as eerie as the stories of carelessness and destruction, and yet and also just as hard to sort of grapple with, because it I think for most of us it just feels like science fiction. But the truth is, these changes are already happening rapidly, and it's the culture that has to catch up to what's going on in the sciences.
Absolutely. And you're right. It is science fiction. I mean, kids going to a pond to look for two-headed frogs, double yelping is, something out of, a science fiction novel in a way. And yet this has happened.
Bringing back extinct species, by merging other species, creating new, novel transgenic species. Louisiana, the effort to rebuild the coastline by retraining the flow of the Mississippi River. These are gargantuan interventions with huge repercussions. Not just ecological, but economic, foreign policy. Basically every sphere of human activity is being reshaped by some of these ecological interventions that are now coming along and will increasingly come down the pike. And, I feel like it's the eeriness of a lot of these stories comes from the fact that we haven't, as a society, really grappled with our powers and what they can do. And I feel like, that's what I found myself drawn to, is trying to tell stories about some of these major interventions that are going on to try to get past the sort of shock of the new and try to understand the ways in which these, the connections between the kind of interventions that are coming and the kind of interventions that have brought us to this point. Essentially, I think what we haven't established is a kind of moral framework for how we should interfere. We know things have gotten pretty bad on our watch. We know we want to correct it, but it's still sort of the Wild West about how we do so. And that's what interests me, I think. And that's where I've sort of focused my attention in these last few years.
The political implications of what you're writing about, it almost seems comical on its face, and it's good fodder perhaps for the late night comics. But, a good half of the country, or maybe slightly half, don't even believe that this is happening. Despite worldwide consensus, virtually every scientist on Earth that's not on the payroll of big chemical companies. And yet we have this political divide that seems more wedged issued than ever. And almost the way they talk about it, like, yeah, the climate's changing. It's like a bad Biff Tannen joke in a Back to the Future movie, how the Republican Party sort of tackles this as a subject. And I wonder how we get out of this just politically. Do you think there's any chance in our lifetime that this is going to change unless we get money out of politics, at least political campaigns? Because it seems like until we ban political contributions from large companies, which after Citizens United became as potent as individual contributions per citizen, it's going to be very hard to win the propaganda battle on this issue.
Yeah, I think of the story about DuPont. There's a moment that I feel like crystallizes this kind of thing where this lawyer, Rob Ballard, who's a corporate lawyer who has turned against corporations and DuPont specifically when he discovers this massive criminal conspiracy. He writes these letters on the letterhead of his fancy corporate firm to the EPA. And to the West Virginia EPA, where this DuPont factory is, over and over again, saying, look, we know the water is tainted with this chemical. We know the chemical causes these awful health conditions. Can you please take action? And he starts to realize, and he does this for years without getting anywhere, really. And he starts to realize that the letters that are coming, the form letters that are coming back to him from the West Virginia EPA, have the names of the same lawyers he's been dealing with for years at DuPont. And he realizes that actually there's just this pipeline between DuPont and the local environmental regulatory agency, so that essentially it's West Virginia EPA is staffed by DuPont's own lawyers, and they just go back and forth between the two institutions. And he realizes almost this sort of comic futility of what he's after. And a version of that also happens, of course, in the U.S. Congress as well, and U.S. EPA. So I think one does, get depressed about these things. On the other hand, and the possibility of real change, on the other hand, we do have, for the moment, a Democratic trifecta that's trying to push through massive legislation. And we've seen a sea change in public opinion about these issues, to the point where climate is now the number one in some surveys concern of Democratic Party voters. Even on the right, opinions have shifted. They have a long ways to go, of course, if we're going to get to the point where we have a kind of consensus on the need for major reform. And so I think a lot can be done, and I think there's also tremendous technological change happening. But I also think we're not going to be able to avoid a situation where some kind of massive human intervention is necessary to basically mop up after ourselves. And what form that takes, remains to be seen, some kind of geoengineering. There will certainly be a lot of climate mitigation that's already happening in Louisiana. I've written about that in Second Nature. This coastal master plan to rebuild the coast is essentially the world's biggest and most ambitious climate change mitigation plan, although the state, never uses the terms climate change, given that it's a, ruby red constituency here, but that's what it is. It's an effort to rebuild the state to adjust to sea level rise and increased vulnerability to hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico. So, change is happening, and the question is, I don't think the question is any longer, how do we avoid this from happening? That might have been a valid question in the period I wrote about in Losing Earth in the 1980s, but it's how do we limit the disaster, which is a less exciting, cause perhaps to rally around, but it's just as important. And I think the thing to understand with climate change in particular is that there's a huge range of outcomes still available to us, and that there's a big difference between, say, 2-degree warming and even 2.1 degree warming, and 2.1 versus 2.3 degree warming, and so on. And so, I'm not particularly optimistic, but I'm also I don't feel like we're headed towards the worst case scenario either. And I think that there has been a huge shift in public opinion just the last few years, and I think as you see that go through, and you see a new generation, really shift on these issues, I think there is some possibility of some transformative change. But yes, I think you have to temper your optimism with a little bit of realism as well, given the shape of our democracy.
To bring up one kind of, I guess, sort of contemporary example, just to get your thoughts on this. A few months back in Texas, there was this big storm, and because Texas is Texas, we don't need the United States. They're not on the grid. And so all these people unnecessarily died. There was all sorts of, travails all over the state. And yet the governor went on television and blamed the whole problem on the Green New Deal, which is only a concept, if I understand it correctly. It's not actually a law. But I think it seems with something like an issue like this is it's hard to win the PR battle when the other side is using, basically like Lee Atwater style subterfuge to distract from what's really happening, which was that the grid dying was what caused all of the mayhem, not some liberal policies on the climate.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the way politics works now. Of course, there's certain catchphrases that are used to animate debates, but I think Louisiana actually is an instructive case study of this, because bright red state. I'm sure if you polled the state on are you worried about climate change, we'd be near the bottom. On the other hand, we have, as I was saying, this massive $50 billion 50-year climate infrastructure plan that is the most ambitious climate policy in the world, I think. And it's the kind of policy that we're going to have to enact, all over the place, in that it's a long-term policy that has no real set ending, right? It's designed to operate in perpetuity. It's a 50-year project, but every 5 years it renews. So it's always looking forward to the next 50 years, which is actually sort of how the control of the Mississippi River is operated too. It's a constantly updating, fluent situation. And so not to using water terms, but they're constantly adapting it to the reality of the river. And in the same way, Louisiana's going to constantly adjust its master plan to the reality of where the coast is. And and even in the best case scenario with the master plan, the goal is not even to save the southern coast, because we're essentially, I think the experts on the matter, there's one scientist at Tulane who says, we're past the tipping point already, because the southern coast of Louisiana has been deteriorating for almost a century now, largely thanks to human activities and oil and gas drilling and the hemming in of the Mississippi River. And so, it's a kind of it's not the kind of plan that you would think would win a lot of political support, like an effort to try to just postpone the inevitable while massively reconfiguring what remains by introducing huge flows of river water into the marshes, these delicate marshes south of New Orleans. And yet, it's passed with near unanimous support here. I have a story about the few people who are viciously opposed to it, but and it's looks like it will be effective. It looks like it will pass. It has passed in some sense, but the projects haven't started to be built yet, but they will soon. The state is accomplishing all this while avoiding any talk of climate change. And I feel like, the further, I think there are two lessons there. I mean, one is that if you avoid the kind of like buzzwords, I think you could actually get a lot done. And that's sort of a political game that seems to have been played pretty effectively here by the state. The other side of it is that, the climate policies of the Republican National Party in the U.S. they don't hold as you go down to local, down the ladder. And Texas might not be a great example of this, but Louisiana and Florida, which is imperiled, by climate change more than basically anyone else in the country. The local Republicans on the coast are not climate change deniers, and so they know, they are, they say they need money to adapt to climate change. They need money to adapt to sea level rise and so on. And so it's a kind of top-down propaganda that I think, because of the way that it's been, it was created, originally by the oil and gas industry in a series of white papers that I uncovered for Losing Earth. It doesn't quite have the staying power with individual voters that other core issues do. It's not like the abortion issue, for instance, which is something that a lot of people felt strongly about, and then the party co-opted. This is a top-down propaganda effort, and so I think as you get to practicalities, I think people are a lot more budgeable on these issues than they might appear to be. But we'll see. I mean, I think what's happening in Louisiana, what's happening in parts of Florida, even among Republican constituencies, gives one some reason for hope. But of course, there are tremendous obstacles that remain.
Yeah, you make a really good point, too, just about the semantics of it, right? Like, I remember during the whole healthcare debate, if you polled people who might have leaned Republican or independent, do you like Medicare? Do you like universal healthcare? As long as you didn't call it Obamacare, then they were into it.
Right.
But you're right. To point out, it does make me feel somewhat optimistic, especially in a place where a lot of the people who represent Louisiana in the Congress and the Senate are almost like right-wing Fox News stars who say crazy things for sound bites, but on a local level, it's actually getting done, which is remarkable.
Right. Yeah. It's a oil and gas state. It's essentially a petro colony, and so that you have these major initiatives happening here. Now there's, not to paint like too glowing a picture of what goes on in this state, is totally, embedded within the oil and gas industry. And yet there's a certain self-interest that comes into play at a certain point. I mean, good example in southern Louisiana, you have a huge amount of oil and gas facilities. These companies know what's going on. They don't want to lose billions of dollars of infrastructure to rising seas either. So there's a kind of cynical self-interest that kicks in at a certain point with climate change where, at first it doesn't really seem to affect you if you're not living next to like a forest that's going to ignite on fire or next to right on the coast. But then once you start to realize that, we're all wrapped up in this, I think people change their minds, and certainly corporations have to pay more attention to their bottom lines as well. And so doesn't mean they start doing the right thing out of some kindness in their heart, but when you get to a point of crisis, some change, ultimately is forced.
I'm curious how you stumbled upon some of these pieces. I mean, I guess maybe after you've written about a subject matter, you might hear from people, but you're based in New Orleans, yet a lot of these stories in the book are kind of all over the place. What is your vetting process, I guess, in sort of finding these stories to tell?
Yeah, I mean, the story about DuPont came to me in a kind of Hollywood way, in that I got just an email over the transom from a lawyer on this team who said, I'm involved in this case that DuPont has this 50-year conspiracy to poison everyone in the world. You got to hear the story. And of course, I thought it was a crazy person, but he sent some court documents, and I started reading instead of deleting the email. And I started to see, like, wait a minute, there's something going on here. And sure enough, there was. But for the most part, I mean, I think they're stories that I encounter, usually, reading some fleeting reference to them, or sort of parenthetically within the context of some other story that's going on, where like alarm bells go off basically, and I say, well, wait a minute, what's going on with that? I mean, the story about this billion-dollar company and really a whole industry of these startups that are trying to culture, chickens and cows in the lab. So in other words, take scrapes of animal cells and create meat out of them. And then with an eye towards revolution, causing this revolution in the way human beings eat meat, by, serving meat without killing any animals, things like that, where I'd sort of seen stuff about it, but I felt no one had really delved into the weirdness and ambition of it in a way that I felt it deserved. And that's the first part, is sort of finding a story that unsettles me in some way. And then the second part is trying to figure out how to tell it, and to tell it in a way that brings out the personal drama in these stories. And there always, of course, is personal drama. And so, the story like it's a chicken story about this company that is trying to mass produce cultured meat. I found that the main chef who was doing it in this lab in San Francisco was the son of a butcher in Central Illinois, and he'd grown up in a sort of old-fashioned butcher shop. And so, I saw there was this story of a father within a generation, from father to son, moves from this primitive butchering to advanced futuristic, culturing of chicken cells. And so it became a kind of father and son story that it spoke to, I think, this larger change that we're seeing at this rapid scale through society. And so I think I don't really there's no real science to it. But I just pay attention when I encounter something that strikes me as just odd or feels confusing in some unsettling way, and that's where I tend to find the best stories.
Second Nature, Scenes from a World Remade by Nathaniel Rich, published by MCD FSG, is out now in hardcover. For the reading this episode, Nathaniel Rich will read from his latest collection, Second Nature.
The first time Ben Novak saw a passenger pigeon, he fell to his knees and remained there, speechless, for 20 minutes. He was 16 years old. At 13, Novak had vowed to devote his life to resurrecting extinct animals. At 14, he saw a photograph of a passenger pigeon in an Audubon Society book and fell in love. There was a single passenger pigeon in his home state of North Dakota, but it was locked in the research collection of the Historical Society in Bismarck. He had no idea that the Science Museum of Minnesota, which he was visiting with a summer program for high school students, had pigeons in its collection, so he was stunned to encounter two stuffed specimens, a male and a female, mounted in lifelike poses. He felt overcome by awe, sadness, and euphoria at the sight of the birds' beauty, their bright auburn breasts, their slate-gray backs, and the dusting of iridescence around their napes that, depending on the light and angle, appeared purple, fuchsia, or green. Before his chaperones dragged him out of the room, Novak snapped a photograph with his disposable camera. The flash was too strong, however, and when the film was processed several weeks later, he was haunted to find that the photograph came back blank, just a flash of white light. Since then, Novak has visited 483 passenger pigeons. He's seen them at the Burke Museum in Seattle, the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and Harvard's Ornithology Department, which possesses 145 specimens, including 8 pigeon corpses preserved in jars of ethanol, 31 eggs, and a partially albino pigeon. There are 1,532 passenger pigeon specimens left on Earth. They've all been dead since the afternoon of September 1st, 1914, when a captive pigeon named Martha expired at the Cincinnati Zoo. She'd outlasted George, the penultimate survivor and her only companion, by 4 years. As news spread of the species' imminent extinction, Martha became a minor tourist attraction. In her final years, whether depressed or just old, Martha, apart from an occasional tremor, barely moved. Zoo visitors threw fistfuls of sand at her to elicit a reaction. When she died, her body was taken to the Cincinnati Ice Company, frozen in a 300-pound ice cube, and sent by freight train to Washington, D.C. At the Smithsonian Institution, she was stuffed and mounted and visited 99 years later by Ben Novak.
To support Big Table, go to bigtablepodcast.org/bookshop. You can help us and independent bookstore culture at the same time. Big Table is produced and presented by Hat and Beard Press, Dub Lab, and Gold Diggers in Los Angeles, and is supported by Invisible Republic, a nonprofit arts organization based in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. You can learn more about their community-based programs and publications at invisiblerepublic.org. Big Table would not exist in the audio world without the expert skill sets, friendship, and dedication of sound designer and editor Matea Bain and audio engineer Jacob Ross. Special thanks to Eric Gorman at Gold Diggers and Alejandro Ali Cohen at Dub Lab for early encouragement and engineering prowess. Thanks again for listening.